when my wife Isabella stood in our master bedroom at 2:47 in the afternoon, speaking on her phone with the door she thought was locked, telling someone that the $48 million inheritance will be mine soon, and all she had to do was wait for the right moment. She had no idea I was watching everything through the security system I had installed 3 weeks earlier. She thought I was just another gullible heir, too blinded by love to see what was happening. In reality, I had been a forensic accountant for 12 years before inheriting my family's estate, and I knew exactly how to spot financial manipulation. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that involved not just my wife, but my business partner, her sister, and a lawyer who had been stealing from my family for 7 years. Comment where you're watching from and drop a like if you've ever had to protect yourself from people you trusted. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Marcus Whitmore, and I inherited a combined estate worth approximately $48 million when my father passed away 18 months ago. The inheritance included commercial real estate properties in Manhattan, a technology company my grandfather founded in 1987, investment portfolios managed by 3 different firms, and the family mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I'm sitting right now as I tell you this story. My father, Richard Whitmore, had spent 37 years building his wealth through careful investments and strategic business decisions. He was a man who taught me that money reveals character. It doesn't create it. I met Isabella Cordova at a charity gala in Manhattan 3 years ago, 6 months before my father's diagnosis. She was working as an event coordinator for the organization hosting the gala, and I was immediately drawn to her confidence, her intelligence, and the way she seemed genuinely passionate about the cause we were supporting that night. The organization was raising money for literacy programs in underserved communities, and Isabella gave a speech about growing up in a neighborhood where access to books was limited. She talked about how a single library changed her life, how education became her way out of poverty, how she wanted to give other kids the same opportunities she'd had. We dated for 8 months before I proposed. During that time, she never asked about my family's money. She insisted on paying for half of our dates. When I wanted to take her to expensive restaurants, she suggested we cook together at her apartment instead. She drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic and lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, even though I offered multiple times to help with her rent. Everything about her suggested she valued independence and authenticity over material wealth. The proposal happened at the same library she had mentioned in her speech at the gala. I worked with the librarian to set up a private dinner in the reading room after hours, surrounded by the books that had meant so much to Isabella's childhood. When I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me, she cried for 20 minutes before she could even say yes. The ring was a 2-carat diamond that cost $63,000. And she initially said it was too much, that she would be happy with something simpler. We got married 11 months ago, 4 months after my father passed away. The wedding was at the Greenwich mansion, a beautiful ceremony with 217 guests, most of them Isabella's family and friends, since my own family had become quite small over the years. My mother had passed away when I was 19, and I had no siblings. My father's side of the family consisted mainly of distant cousins I barely knew. Isabella's family, in contrast, was large and warm. Her parents, Miguel and Sophia, seemed genuinely kind. Her sister Victoria appeared to be Isabella's best friend and closest confidant. The first 6 months of our marriage were everything I had hoped for. Isabella moved into the Greenwich mansion, but she insisted on keeping her job as an event coordinator, saying she needed her own sense of purpose and identity. She was respectful of my late father's belongings, understanding when I wanted to keep certain rooms exactly as they had been. She supported my decision to continue running the family's technology company rather than selling it, even though several investors had offered substantial sums. But 3 months ago, something changed. It started with small things that individually meant nothing, but together began forming a pattern that made me uncomfortable. Isabella started asking specific questions about my investment portfolios, questions that seemed too detailed for casual curiosity. She wanted to know about the technology company's quarterly earnings, the rental income from the Manhattan properties, the structure of the family trusts. When I asked why she was suddenly so interested, she said she wanted to understand our financial situation better so she could help manage household expenses more effectively. Then I noticed she had started having long phone conversations that she would abruptly end when I entered the room. She claimed they were work calls, but when I casually mentioned I might call her office one day to take her to lunch, she quickly said her boss preferred they not receive personal calls during business hours. Her sister Victoria started visiting the mansion more frequently, often when I was supposedly at work. though I had begun working from home several days a week without mentioning it to anyone. The real wake-up call came when I received a phone call from Jonathan Pierce, my father's estate attorney, and a man who had known our family for 32 years. Jonathan asked if we could meet for lunch, saying he needed to discuss some concerns about recent activities related to my father's estate. We met at a restaurant in Manhattan, and Jonathan showed me documents that made my blood run cold. Someone had attempted to access my father's estate documents through the law firm's client portal, using what appeared to be legitimate credentials. The attempt had been flagged by the firm's security system because it came from an IP address that wasn't registered to me or to Jonathan's firm. The person trying to access the documents had been looking specifically at the will, the trust structures, and the beneficiary designations on several accounts. When Jonathan's IT department traced the IP address, it led to a coffee shop in Queens, 3 blocks from where Isabella used to live. Jonathan wasn't accusing anyone directly, but he suggested I consider the possibility that someone close to me might be trying to understand the full scope of my inheritance for reasons that weren't entirely innocent. He recommended I consider implementing additional security measures and perhaps monitoring any unusual behavior around me. This conversation happened on a Wednesday afternoon, and I spent the entire drive back to Greenwich thinking about everything I had noticed over the past few months. That same evening, I called a security company that specialized in residential surveillance systems, a company my father had used years ago for the Manhattan properties. I met with their consultant, a former FBI agent named David Chen, who now ran a private security firm. I explained my situation without naming names, and David suggested a comprehensive camera system that would cover the main living areas of the mansion while still respecting privacy in bedrooms and bathrooms. The cameras would be discreet, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and they would be accessible only through a secure app on my phone. The installation took 3 days. I told Isabella that I was having a new security system installed because there had been a series of burglaries in nearby neighborhoods, which was actually true. She seemed supportive of the idea, even suggesting we might want to add cameras to the garage and the garden areas. I agreed, which actually worked in my favor because it made the entire project seem less suspicious. The cameras went live on a Monday morning. I was at the office that day, genuinely working on a major contract negotiation for the technology company. Around 2 p.m., I received a notification on my phone that motion had been detected in the main study, a room where my father's personal files and important documents were kept. I opened the app expecting to see Isabella perhaps looking for a book or some household paperwork. Instead, I saw Isabella and her sister Victoria systematically photographing documents from my father's desk. They weren't just casually looking through papers. They had organized them into stacks, and Victoria was using her phone to take clear, high-resolution photos of each document. I watched for 17 minutes as they worked through bank statements, investment records, property deeds, and trust documents. They were discussing what they were seeing, but the cameras I had installed didn't have audio in the study, so I couldn't hear what they were saying. I sat at my office desk, my hands shaking, watching my wife betray my trust in real time through a phone screen. The woman I had married, the woman I had believed loved me for who I was rather than what I had, was literally stealing information about my family's wealth, and her sister, who had been so warm and welcoming to me, was actively helping her do it. I didn't confront them that day. Something told me that I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I acted. If Isabella was willing to go through my father's private documents, if she was willing to involve her sister in what was clearly a calculated effort to access information she had no right to, then there had to be more to this situation than simple curiosity about our finances. I spent that evening acting completely normal. I came home at my usual time, had dinner with Isabella, and watched television together like we did most weeknights. She gave no indication that anything unusual had happened that day. She asked about my work, told me about an event she was planning, and suggested we invite her parents over for dinner that weekend. The normalcy of it all made the betrayal feel even more profound. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched through the cameras as a pattern emerged that was far worse than I had initially imagined. Isabella wasn't working alone, and this wasn't a recent development. The conspiracy I was witnessing had clearly been planned long before we got married, possibly even before we met. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the study incident, Isabella had a visitor I didn't recognize. The cameras in the living room showed a man in his mid-40s, wearing an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Isabella greeted him with a familiarity that suggested they knew each other well. They sat in the living room for 47 minutes, and while I still couldn't hear their conversation, their body language told me this was a serious business meeting, not a casual social visit. I took screenshots of the man's face and ran them through a reverse image search. It took less than 10 minutes to identify him as Robert Castellano, a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and trust law. His firm's website described him as an expert in navigating complex inheritance situations and resolving disputes among beneficiaries. What concerned me most was that I had never met this man, never hired him, and certainly never authorized Isabella to consult with an estate lawyer on my behalf. The following Monday, I arranged to work from home without telling Isabella. I said I was going to the office as usual, left the house at my normal time, but instead drove to a parking garage 2 blocks away and walked back home, entering through the back entrance that led directly to my private office on the 2nd floor. This office was one of the few rooms where I hadn't installed cameras, precisely because I wanted to maintain some space that was truly private. At 11:30 a.m., I heard voices downstairs. Using the camera app on my phone, I watched as Isabella led in her sister Victoria and the lawyer, Robert Castellano. They settled in the dining room, and I watched as Castellano spread documents across the table, the same documents Isabella and Victoria had photographed 2 weeks earlier. I could see them pointing at specific sections, clearly discussing strategy. What happened next changed everything. At 1:15 p.m., another person arrived, someone I knew but whose presence in this meeting made no sense whatsoever. It was Thomas Bradford, my business partner at the technology company, a man I had trusted with substantial responsibility in running my father's legacy business. Thomas was supposed to be at a meeting with potential investors in Boston. He had sent me an email that very morning explaining he would be unreachable most of the day because of the importance of this meeting. I sat in my office watching through my phone as Thomas embraced Isabella warmly, greeted Victoria like an old friend, and shook hands with Castellano like they were familiar colleagues. The 4 of them sat down at my dining table, in my father's house, and began what was clearly a detailed planning session about something that involved me and my inheritance. I wanted to burst downstairs and confront them all immediately, but I forced myself to wait and observe. I had learned from 12 years as a forensic accountant that the best way to expose fraud is to let it fully develop, to gather complete evidence, and to understand every person involved before making your move. Confronting them now would only cause them to cover their tracks. If I was patient, they would reveal the full scope of their plans. Over the next hour, I watched them pass documents back and forth. Castellano appeared to be explaining something complex, using hand gestures and pointing at specific pages. Thomas nodded frequently, occasionally interjecting with comments. Isabella and Victoria listened attentively, asking questions. The meeting ended at 2:45 p.m. with handshakes all around. Thomas left first, followed 15 minutes later by Castellano. Victoria stayed another 20 minutes, and I watched as she and Isabella celebrated something, raising coffee cups in a toast. That evening I initiated the most difficult conversation of my life. I waited until we were having dinner, just the 2 of us in the breakfast nook that overlooked the garden. Isabella was in an unusually good mood, talking about plans for redecorating one of the guest rooms. I let her talk for a while, and then I said something that I knew would force a response. "Marcus," I said, watching her face carefully, "I've been thinking about updating my estate planning. I want to make sure everything is properly structured now that we're married. I was thinking about calling Jonathan Pierce to discuss setting up some additional trusts." The change in Isabella's expression was instantaneous, but quickly masked. For just a fraction of a second, I saw panic in her eyes, followed immediately by what looked like calculation. Then she smiled and said that sounded like a great idea, that she was glad I was being responsible about these things. But I noticed her hand was shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. I noticed she suddenly seemed less hungry, pushing food around her plate rather than eating. And when I casually mentioned that I was thinking about having Thomas take on a smaller role at the company, because I wanted to be more hands-on with my father's legacy, she responded with unusual intensity, saying that Thomas had been such a valuable partner and that I shouldn't make any hasty decisions about the business structure. After dinner, Isabella said she needed to make some work calls and went to our bedroom. I gave her 15 minutes, then checked the bedroom camera on my phone. I had installed a camera in the hallway outside our bedroom, positioned to show the door in the small sitting area nearby, though not the bedroom interior itself. The camera had audio capability, and I had activated it for this specific area After confirming with David Chen that it was legal to monitor conversations in my own home's common areas, what I heard made everything crystal clear. Isabella was on the phone, speaking in an urgent whisper that the hallway camera picked up clearly. She was talking to Victoria, and the words I heard confirmed my worst fears. "He mentioned calling Jonathan Pierce," Isabella was saying. "We need to move faster than we planned. If he updates his estate planning now, everything we've set up becomes worthless. Tell Robert we need to meet again tomorrow, and tell Thomas he needs to implement the stock transfer we discussed. We can't wait the 3 months we originally planned. This needs to happen in the next 2 weeks. Maximum." I stood in my father's study, listening to my wife discuss stealing my inheritance, and I realized that everything about our relationship had been carefully constructed. The modest apartment, the insistence on paying for her own meals, the refusal of help with rent, the emotional speech about literacy programs and libraries. All of it had been calculated to present an image of someone who didn't care about money. It had been a performance designed specifically to make me trust her, to make me believe she loved me for myself, rather than for the $48 million she was now trying to take. The next morning, I called David Chen and told him I needed to upgrade the security system to include audio in several more rooms. I also asked him to recommend a private investigator who could help me document everything that was happening. David connected me with a former colleague named Sarah Mitchell, who ran an investigation firm that specialized in financial fraud and domestic cases. Sarah and I met that afternoon at a coffee shop in Stamford, far enough from Greenwich that we wouldn't accidentally run into anyone I knew. I showed her everything I had captured on the cameras, explained about the mysterious meeting with Robert Castellano, told her about Thomas's involvement and Isabella's phone call about moving up their timeline. Sarah listened without interruption, taking notes on her tablet. When I finished, Sarah looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy and professional focus. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "what you're describing is a sophisticated conspiracy to defraud you of your inheritance. Based on what you've told me, I believe your wife and the other parties involved have been planning this for an extended period, possibly since before you met her. We need to move carefully but quickly." Sarah explained that she would need to conduct background investigations on Isabella, Victoria, Thomas, and Robert Castellano. She wanted to understand their connections to each other, their financial situations, and their histories. She said she would need approximately 2 weeks to gather comprehensive information, but that in the meantime, I should continue documenting everything through the cameras and behaving as normally as possible around Isabella. The investigation Sarah conducted revealed information that was somehow both shocking and predictable. Isabella Cordova wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Isabella Martinez, and she had changed it legally 6 years ago after being involved in a lawsuit related to financial misrepresentation. The charity event where we met hadn't been coincidental. Victoria, her sister, worked for a company that tracked inheritance databases and identified wealthy individuals who were recently single or vulnerable. The story about growing up in poverty and finding salvation through a library had been partially true, but strategically exaggerated. Isabella had grown up middle class. Her father owned a successful restaurant chain in New Jersey, and she had attended private schools. The speech she gave at the gala had been crafted specifically to appeal to wealthy donors like me, people who valued education and philanthropy. Thomas Bradford's involvement was perhaps the most painful revelation. He had been recruited into the conspiracy 8 months ago when he began having financial difficulties. His wife had left him, taking half of his assets in a divorce settlement, and he was facing mounting debts. Isabella had approached him with an offer. If he helped them access certain company assets and restructure some business agreements, they would cut him in for $2 million from my inheritance. Robert Castellano, the lawyer, turned out to be Victoria's boyfriend. He specialized in finding legal loopholes in estate planning documents and had been involved in 3 previous cases where wealthy widowers or heirs had been manipulated into restructuring their estates in ways that benefited the manipulators. In one case, he had nearly succeeded in helping a woman convince an elderly man to disinherit his own children. The plan they had constructed was elaborate and would have been difficult to detect without the surveillance system. First, Thomas was going to manipulate company documents to make it appear that I had approved certain stock transfers that would gradually shift ownership away from me. This would happen slowly enough that I wouldn't notice until it was too late, and the company would effectively be stolen from under my control. Second, Isabella was going to convince me to update my estate planning documents using Robert Castellano as the attorney, rather than Jonathan Pierce. Castellano would structure the new documents in a way that looked legitimate, but contained provisions that would essentially allow Isabella to control the entire estate if anything happened to me. These provisions were technically legal, but ethically questionable, buried in complex legal language that most people wouldn't understand. Third, and most disturbingly, there was evidence suggesting they were planning to create a situation where I would appear mentally unstable or incompetent to manage my own affairs. Sarah found emails between Isabella and Castellano discussing how to document erratic behavior, how to gather statements from people who would testify about my supposedly declining mental state, and how to potentially force a competency evaluation that would give Isabella power of attorney over my assets. The timeline they were working on had me losing effective control of my inheritance within 4 months, possibly sooner now that I had mentioned calling Jonathan Pierce. Once they had control, they would systematically drain the assets, restructure everything to their benefit, and by the time I realized what had happened and tried to fight back legally, there would be nothing left to fight for. Sarah presented all of this information to me 2 weeks after our initial meeting. We were in her office, and she had organized everything into a comprehensive report with supporting documentation, photographic evidence, email records, and financial documents. The stack of evidence was 3 inches thick. "Now comes the important question," Sarah said. "What do you want to do about this? You have enough evidence to press criminal charges against all 4 of them: fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, forgery of business documents, identity fraud. Isabella and Victoria could face federal charges. Thomas would lose his professional license and face substantial prison time. Castellano could be disbarred and prosecuted." I sat in Sarah's office, looking at the evidence that would destroy 4 people's lives, and I realized I had a choice to make about what kind of person I wanted to be in this moment. My father had always taught me that wealth comes with responsibility, not just for yourself but for how you treat others, even those who wrong you. He used to say that revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but justice and wisdom create better outcomes for everyone involved. I spent 3 days thinking about what to do. During those 3 days, I continued monitoring the cameras, watching as Isabella and Victoria met again, as Thomas made additional suspicious changes to company documents, as Castellano prepared legal documents that were clearly the fraudulent estate planning papers Sarah had warned me about. On Thursday evening, I made my decision. I called a meeting for the following Monday morning at my lawyer Jonathan Pierce's office. I invited Isabella, Thomas, and Robert Castellano, telling each of them that I wanted to discuss estate planning and business restructuring. I told Isabella I had decided to take her advice about having Thomas remain heavily involved in the company. I told Thomas I was considering some exciting expansion opportunities. I told Castellano, through Isabella, that I was interested in his services for updating my estate documents. That weekend was surreal. Isabella was in an exceptionally good mood, clearly believing that her plan was working perfectly. We went to dinner with her parents, Miguel and Sofia, and I found myself watching them carefully, wondering if they knew what their daughters were doing. They seemed genuinely kind and unaware, which suggested Isabella and Victoria had kept them in the dark about their conspiracy. Sunday night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the meeting the next day, about the confrontation that was coming, about the choice I had made about how to handle this situation. Monday morning arrived. I left the house early, telling Isabella I needed to review some documents with Jonathan before everyone arrived. What I actually did was meet with Jonathan, Sarah Mitchell, and a federal prosecutor named Jennifer Hayes who specialized in financial fraud cases. Jennifer was someone Sarah had worked with before, someone who understood both the legal complexities of this case and the emotional difficulty of prosecuting family members. At 10:00 a.m., Isabella, Thomas, and Robert Castellano arrived at Jonathan Pierce's office. They were shown into a large conference room where I was waiting with Jonathan. There was no indication yet that anything was wrong. I greeted them all warmly. Isabella kissed my cheek. Thomas shook my hand enthusiastically. Castellano had brought his briefcase full of fraudulent documents, ready to trap me into signing away my inheritance. We sat down at the conference table, and I let them begin their presentation. Castellano was smooth and professional, explaining how he had drafted estate planning documents that would protect my assets while giving Isabella appropriate security as my wife. Thomas had prepared a presentation about restructuring the company's ownership to allow for what he called strategic expansion opportunities. Isabella sat beside me, holding my hand, playing the role of supportive wife. I let them talk for 20 minutes. I asked questions that made it seem like I was seriously considering everything they were proposing, and then I said something that changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. Before we proceed, I said calmly, I think we should discuss the surveillance footage I've collected over the past 3 weeks. The reaction was instantaneous. Isabella's hand jerked away from mine. Thomas's face went pale. Castellano stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open. I nodded to Jonathan, who pressed a button on a remote control. A large screen on the wall came to life, showing footage from my security cameras. The first clip showed Isabella and Victoria photographing documents in my father's study. The second showed the 4 of them meeting at my dining table, clearly planning something. The third was from the hallway outside my bedroom, with audio of Isabella's phone call to Victoria about moving up their timeline. I'm also going to invite some other people to join our meeting, I said, and pressed the intercom button on the conference table phone. Sarah Mitchell entered the room, followed by Jennifer Hayes, who introduced herself as an assistant U.S. attorney. The 3 conspirators looked like they wanted to run, but there were now 2 security officers standing outside the conference room door, visible through the glass walls. Jennifer took over from there. She laid out exactly what crimes had been committed, what evidence existed, and what the potential sentences were. Identity fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted embezzlement, forgery of business documents, wire fraud related to the emails they had sent. The federal charges alone could result in 15 to 20 years in prison for each of them. But then I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including Jonathan and Sarah, who knew me fairly well by this point. I don't want to press charges, I said. Jennifer looked at me with surprise. Mr. Whitmore, she said, these people attempted to steal millions of dollars from you. They conspired together, they lied to you, they betrayed your trust. You have every right to prosecute them. I know, I said, and I understand why you think I should. But sending them to prison doesn't get me back what I've lost, which is my trust, my marriage, and my sense of security in my own home. What I want instead is something different. I turned to face Isabella, Thomas, and Castellano directly. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Isabella, you're going to sign divorce papers that Jonathan has prepared. You will receive nothing from me. Not the house, not alimony, not a settlement of any kind. You will leave my home today, and you will never contact me again. Thomas, you're going to resign from the technology company immediately and sell me back your shares at exactly the price you paid for them when you became a partner. You will sign documents acknowledging that you attempted to defraud the company and that you're resigning to avoid prosecution. You will never work in this industry again. Robert Castellano, you're going to surrender all documents you've prepared related to my estate. You're going to provide a written confession of your involvement in this conspiracy, and you're going to accept voluntary disbarment. The State Bar Association will receive a full report of your conduct. All 3 of you are going to sign agreements acknowledging your fraud and waiving any right to ever bring legal action against me or my estate. If any of you violate these agreements, if you contact me, if you speak publicly about this case, if you try to profit from this story in any way, then every piece of evidence we have will be turned over to the prosecutor, and you will be charged with every applicable crime. But if you comply fully, if you accept these consequences and move on with your lives, then I will not press criminal charges. You won't go to prison. You'll have a chance to rebuild your lives, though obviously not the lives you were trying to steal from me. The room was completely silent. Isabella was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of someone who had been caught and was facing consequences. Thomas looked devastated, realizing his career was over. Castellano was calculating, clearly trying to figure out if there was any way out of this situation. Why? Isabella finally asked, her voice breaking. Why would you let us go after what we did? Because prison would be my revenge, I said. But my father taught me that revenge doesn't heal anything. Justice means holding you accountable, and that's what these agreements do. You each lose what you tried to steal and what you abused to try to steal it. Isabella loses the marriage and financial security she was trying to exploit. Thomas loses his career and business partnership. Castellano loses his law license. That's proportional justice. But more importantly, I said, looking directly at Isabella, I don't want to become the kind of person who ruins lives out of anger. Yes, you betrayed me in the worst possible way. Yes, everything we had was a lie. But sending you to prison for 20 years doesn't undo that betrayal. It just adds more pain to the world. I'd rather end this chapter of my life and move forward than spend years caught up in criminal trials and appeals. Jennifer Hayes looked at me with what I interpreted as respect mixed with professional frustration. "It's your decision, Mr. Whitmore," she said, "but I want you to know that what you're offering them is extraordinarily generous, given what they attempted to do." Over the next 4 hours, they signed everything. Isabella signed the divorce papers with shaking hands. Thomas signed his resignation and the share buyback agreement. Castellano signed his confession and his agreement to voluntary disbarment. Every document was witnessed by Jonathan and Sarah, legally binding and enforceable. By 3 p.m. it was done. Isabella left the office escorted by security, going directly to the Greenwich mansion to collect her personal belongings under supervision. She would have 4 hours to pack what she wanted, and then she would leave my home forever. Thomas left looking 20 years older than he had that morning, his career and reputation destroyed by his own choices. Castellano left in silence, his legal career over at 46 years old. After they were gone, I sat in Jonathan's office with him, Sarah, and Jennifer. Jennifer was reviewing all the signed agreements, ensuring everything was legally sound. Sarah was organizing the evidence files for secure storage. Jonathan was simply sitting with me, providing the quiet support of someone who had known my family for 3 decades. "Your father would be proud of how you handled this," Jonathan said finally. "Not because of the specific decision you made, but because you thought carefully about who you wanted to be when making it. That's what Richard always taught you, to think about the long-term consequences of your actions on your own character." I spent that night alone in the Greenwich mansion for the first time since Isabella moved in. The house felt enormous and empty. I walked through the rooms where I had watched my wife betray me through camera footage, where I had seen my business partner conspire to steal my father's company, where I had learned that nearly a year of my life had been built on lies. It would have been easy to feel bitter, to feel like trusting anyone had been a mistake. But as I sat in my father's study, surrounded by the documents that Isabella and Victoria had photographed, I realized that the lesson here wasn't that trust is dangerous. The lesson was that trust has to be earned through consistent action over time, and that my mistake hadn't been trusting Isabella, it had been trusting her too quickly and ignoring the subtle warning signs when they appeared. Over the following weeks, I discovered the full extent of how the conspiracy had been constructed. Victoria had identified me as a target through a database of recent inheritance records that her company maintained. She had researched my background, learned about my values and interests, and then positioned Isabella to meet me at an event where she knew I would be vulnerable to someone who seemed genuine and uninterested in wealth. Isabella had been in relationships with 4 other wealthy men before me, each ending after she determined that they either didn't have as much money as she thought, or that their assets were too well protected to access. I was target number 5, and I had been the most successful target because I had inherited recently, because I was emotionally vulnerable after my father's death, and because I genuinely wanted to believe in a love story that wasn't complicated by money. The discovery that hurt most wasn't Isabella's betrayal itself, but learning how many moments I had thought were genuine were actually calculated performances. The proposal at the library, where she had cried for 20 minutes, had been practiced. Sarah's investigation revealed that Isabella had used the same library proposal strategy with 2 previous targets, both of whom had proposed to her in emotionally significant locations after she had shared carefully crafted stories about her past. The insistence on paying for her own meals and refusing help with rent had been a strategy specifically designed to make me believe she didn't care about my money. Even her close relationship with her parents had been partially manufactured, bringing me into their lives to make me feel like I was becoming part of a loving family. What made the betrayal even more complex was discovering that Victoria had been the mastermind behind most of the operation. Sarah's investigation revealed that Victoria had worked for a data analytics company that specialized in tracking wealth transfers, inheritance records, and life events that made wealthy individuals vulnerable. She had built what was essentially a database of targets, people who had recently inherited substantial amounts, who were single or recently divorced, who had expressed interest in philanthropy or social causes, and who had patterns suggesting they might be susceptible to romantic manipulation. Victoria's company, which presented itself as a legitimate estate planning research firm, actually sold information to lawyers like Castellano and to individuals like Isabella, who were looking for wealthy targets. The company's database included not just financial information, but detailed psychological profiles built from social media activity, public records, and purchases from data brokers. When my father's death became public record, and when the probate documents revealed the size of his estate, I was entered into their system as a high-value target. The selection of Isabella as the person to approach me hadn't been random. Victoria had 3 different people she could have deployed, all women who were trained in what they called relationship-based asset acquisition. Isabella was chosen specifically because my social media activity and the few interviews I had given about my father's company suggested I valued authenticity, education, and social responsibility. The library speech, the charity work, the modest lifestyle, all of it was tailored specifically to appeal to the values I had publicly expressed. Thomas Bradford's recruitment into the conspiracy had its own complicated backstory that Sarah's investigation uncovered. His involvement hadn't started as a deliberate betrayal. Initially, he had been a legitimate business partner, someone my father had trusted, and someone I had good reason to trust as well. But his financial situation had become desperate after his divorce, and Victoria had identified him as a potential weak point in my defenses. The approach to Thomas had been sophisticated. Victoria had used a third party, a business consultant named Richard Huang, to contact Thomas about helping him restructure his finances after the divorce. Richard presented himself as someone who specialized in helping executives recover from financially devastating divorces. Over several months, Richard gained Thomas's confidence and learned details about my business operations, my decision-making process, and my relationship with Isabella. Then, 8 months ago, Richard revealed his actual purpose. He told Thomas that he worked with people who specialized in wealth transfer strategies, and that Thomas had an opportunity to solve his financial problems permanently. If Thomas would provide inside information about the technology company and help facilitate certain business transactions, he would receive $2 million. The money would be paid through an offshore account structure that would be extremely difficult to trace. Thomas had initially refused. According to Richard's notes, which Sarah obtained through contacts at the FBI who were investigating Richard for unrelated fraud, Thomas had been horrified by the proposal and had threatened to report Richard to authorities. But Richard was experienced at manipulation. He told Thomas that if he reported anything, Isabella would simply disappear from my life, I would never know I had been targeted, and Thomas would be left with his crushing debts and no way to recover. Then Richard applied more pressure. He showed Thomas that he had evidence of minor financial irregularities Thomas had committed during his divorce proceedings, nothing seriously illegal, but enough to damage his reputation if revealed publicly. He suggested that cooperating would be safer than refusing. And finally, he appealed to something that Sarah said many fraud conspirators use, a form of rationalization that makes betrayal feel justified. Richard told Thomas that I didn't really need all the money I had inherited, that inheriting such wealth at a young age without working for it was itself a form of unfairness, and that redistributing some of that wealth to people who actually needed it was morally defensible. This rationalization, Sarah explained, is common in inheritance fraud cases. People convince themselves they're correcting an injustice rather than committing a crime. Thomas succumbed to the pressure gradually. He started by providing small pieces of information, details about company operations that seemed harmless. Then he progressed to making minor changes to business documents, adjustments that appeared to be normal business decisions, but that were actually laying groundwork for the larger fraud. By the time I installed the security cameras, Thomas was fully involved in the conspiracy, though Sarah's investigation suggested he was deeply conflicted about what he was doing. One of the subplots that emerged from Sarah's investigation involved discovering that Isabella and Victoria had attempted similar schemes with 3 other wealthy men before targeting me. 2 of those attempts had failed when the targets became suspicious and ended the relationships. One had partially succeeded, resulting in a settlement during divorce proceedings that netted Isabella approximately $470,000, though it took nearly 3 years of legal fighting, and the target never realized it had been a planned fraud rather than a legitimate marriage gone wrong. The 4th previous target, a real estate developer in Chicago named Marcus Chen, had figured out what was happening and had considered pressing charges but ultimately decided against it for reasons similar to mine. When Sarah contacted him as part of her investigation, Marcus told her that pursuing prosecution would have consumed years of his life and kept him connected to someone he needed to move on from. He had chosen instead to end the relationship quietly and focus on rebuilding his life. His experience and advice had actually influenced my own decision about how to handle the situation. Another subplot involved discovering that Robert Castellano had used similar estate planning manipulation schemes in 6 different cases over the previous 8 years. In 3 of those cases, elderly widows or widowers had been convinced to restructure their estates in ways that benefited Castellano's clients, usually women who had entered into quick relationships with the vulnerable targets. In one case, an 82-year-old man had been convinced to disinherit his 3 children in favor of a 53-year-old woman he had been dating for only 5 months. That case had resulted in a lawsuit that was eventually settled. But Castellano had avoided professional discipline because the estate planning documents were technically legal, just ethically questionable. The Bar Association had actually investigated Castellano twice before for similar conduct, but he had managed to avoid disbarment by arguing that he was simply following his client's instructions and that the estate planning documents he created were legally sound. It was only the evidence I provided, showing clear conspiracy and intent to defraud, that finally gave the Bar Association enough justification to accept his voluntary disbarment without a protracted legal fight. The third subplot involved Victoria's company and the larger network of people involved in targeting wealthy inheritance recipients. Sarah's investigation revealed that Victoria's database contained information on approximately 2,300 individuals who fit the profile of vulnerable, wealthy targets. The company had facilitated at least 63 relationships between operators like Isabella and these targets over the previous 7 years, resulting in what Sarah estimated was approximately $42 million in successful wealth transfers through various schemes. Sarah turned this information over to the FBI, which opened an investigation into Victoria's company and the broader network of people involved in these schemes. While I chose not to press charges in my specific case, providing information about the larger operation was something I felt ethically obligated to do. The investigation eventually led to federal charges against 12 individuals and the shutdown of Victoria's company, though Victoria herself avoided prosecution by cooperating fully with investigators and testifying against the others involved. When I was deciding how to handle the confrontation at Jonathan's office, I had consulted with 3 different people whose opinions I valued and who provided different perspectives. The first was Jonathan Pierce himself, my father's longtime attorney. Jonathan's advice was measured and lawyer-like. He pointed out that I had every legal right to press charges, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that prosecution would serve as both justice and deterrent. But he also acknowledged that the legal process would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining, and that my father had always valued resolution over retribution when dealing with business conflicts. The second person I consulted was David Chen, the security consultant who had installed my camera system. David's perspective was more security-focused. He argued that people like Isabella, Victoria, Thomas, and Castellano were likely to continue their behavior unless they faced serious consequences, and that choosing not to prosecute might inadvertently enable them to victimize others in the future. He suggested that pressing charges was not just about personal justice but about protecting potential future victims. The third person was actually my father's personal physician, Dr. Dao, Elizabeth Morrison, who had cared for my father during his final illness and who had become something like a family friend. Dr. Morrison's perspective was more philosophical and psychological. She pointed out that my father had always believed that how you handle adversity reveals more about your character than how you handle success, and that my decision should be based on who I wanted to become, rather than on what Isabella deserved. She suggested that the question wasn't whether prosecution was justified, which it clearly was, but whether it would help me heal and move forward, which was less clear. These 3 perspectives, legal, practical, and philosophical, helped me think through the decision more carefully. In the end, I realized that while prosecution was justified and would have been the choice many people would make, it wasn't the choice that aligned with my values and my goals for my own life. I wanted to be someone who held people accountable without being consumed by revenge, someone who protected myself without becoming bitter, and someone who could move forward rather than remaining tethered to a painful past through years of legal proceedings. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation at Jonathan's office was more complicated than I had anticipated. While Isabella, Thomas, and Castellano all signed the agreements I had prepared, the process of actually implementing those agreements took several months and involved numerous additional complications. Isabella initially tried to negotiate for some kind of settlement, arguing through a lawyer she had hired that she was entitled to spousal support because we had been married for 11 months. Her lawyer sent Jonathan a letter claiming that the divorce was unconscionable and that the agreements Isabella had signed were made under duress. Jonathan responded with a letter that was 23 pages long, detailing every piece of evidence we had, explaining exactly what crimes had been committed, and noting that the agreement Isabella signed was extraordinarily generous compared to the prosecution she would face if she pursued litigation. Isabella's lawyer withdrew from the case 2 weeks later, and Isabella signed the final divorce papers without further protest. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the confrontation, officially ending our marriage and ensuring Isabella received nothing from the estate or from our shared assets, which had been minimal since I had been careful not to commingle my inherited wealth with marital assets. Thomas's resignation from the technology company was similarly complicated. While he had signed an agreement to resign and sell back his shares, actually executing that share buyback required several months of negotiation about the exact valuation of the company and the terms of payment. Thomas tried to argue that the company was worth more than I was offering, which would have increased the price I had to pay for his shares. Jonathan countered by pointing out that Thomas's fraud had actually damaged the company's value, and that if we went to litigation to resolve the share price dispute, all of Thomas's misconduct would become part of the public record, essentially destroying any chance he had of rebuilding his career in any field. Thomas eventually accepted the original buyback terms, selling me his 33% ownership stake for exactly what he had paid for it 7 years earlier, which was approximately $860,000. This was substantially less than what the shares would have been worth if he hadn't been involved in fraud, but it was more than he would have gotten if I had pressed charges and the shares had been seized as proceeds of crime. Castellano's voluntary disbarment was the most straightforward of the 3 consequences to implement. He signed the papers, submitted his confession to the Bar Association, and his law license was formally revoked 6 weeks after the confrontation. The Bar Association's report on his disbarment was carefully worded to avoid specific allegations that might expose me to privacy concerns, but it was clear enough that anyone who read it would understand he had engaged in serious ethical violations related to estate planning fraud. What I hadn't anticipated was the emotional toll of watching my life dismantle and rebuild over the months following the confrontation. I spent a lot of time in therapy, working with a psychologist named Dr. Patricia Williams, who specialized in helping people process betrayal trauma. Dr. Williams helped me understand that what I was experiencing was similar to grief, that I was mourning not just the loss of my marriage, but the loss of the story I had believed about my life, about Isabella's love, about the future we had supposedly been building together. One of the insights Dr. Williams helped me develop was understanding the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. She explained that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, releasing the emotional burden of anger and resentment so you can move forward. Reconciliation, however, is something that requires the other person to genuinely change and to rebuild trust over time. I could forgive Isabella for what she had done, understanding that she was a product of her own choices and circumstances, but reconciliation was neither possible nor desirable given that our entire relationship had been based on deception. The selling of the Greenwich mansion took 7 months from decision to closing. The house sold for $12.3 million, which was slightly below market value because I was motivated to sell quickly rather than waiting for the perfect offer. The buyers were a family from California who had relocated to Connecticut for business reasons, and they loved the property's history and architecture. I was glad the house went to people who would appreciate it rather than to developers who might have wanted to tear it down and build something new. During the process of moving out of the Greenwich mansion, I spent considerable time going through my father's belongings, items I had left largely untouched since his death. I found journals he had kept, letters he had written but never sent, photographs from his own life that I had never seen before. Reading through his journals, I discovered that my father had his own experiences with betrayal and manipulation early in his career, situations where people he trusted had tried to take advantage of his success. What struck me most was reading my father's reflections on those experiences. He wrote about the temptation to become cynical, to stop trusting anyone, to view every relationship through a lens of suspicion, but he also wrote about consciously choosing not to let betrayal change his fundamental character, about learning to be more discerning without becoming bitter, about maintaining his capacity for generosity, even after being taken advantage of. These journals reinforced for me that I had made the right choice in how I handled Isabella's betrayal, that I was following a pattern my father had established of responding to wrongdoing with wisdom rather than with revenge. One particularly meaningful entry from my father's journal, dated about 15 years before I found it, addressed exactly the kind of situation I was facing. He wrote, "When someone betrays you, you face a choice about who you will become in response. You can become someone defined by that betrayal, someone who builds walls so high that nothing can hurt you but nothing can reach you either, or you can become someone who acknowledges the pain, learns from it, and remains open to genuine connection despite the risk. The first path feels safer but leads to isolation. The second path feels dangerous but leads to wisdom. Choose the dangerous path that leads to wisdom." Reading those words, written by my father long before he could have known I would need them, felt like receiving advice directly from him, even though he was gone. It strengthened my resolve that I had made the right decision, that choosing not to prosecute wasn't weakness but was actually a form of strength, a conscious choice to remain the kind of person my father had raised me to be. The Vermont farmhouse I bought was significantly different from the Greenwich mansion, both in size and character. The property was 43 acres of mixed woodland and open fields, with a restored 19th-century farmhouse that had been updated with modern amenities while maintaining its historic character. The house had 5 bedrooms, which felt enormous for one person, but modest compared to the 12-bedroom mansion I was leaving. What I loved most was the property's privacy and the sense of connection to the land. 3 months after the confrontation at Jonathan's office, I received a letter. It was from Miguel and Sofia Cordova, Isabella's parents. The letter was heartfelt and apologetic. They explained that they had no idea what Isabella and Victoria had been planning, that they were devastated to learn their daughters had done this, and that they understood if I never wanted to hear from them again. But they wanted me to know that their affection for me had been genuine, that they had truly believed Isabella loved me, and that they were deeply sorry for the pain their daughters had caused. I called them that evening. We talked for over an hour. Miguel told me that Isabella had always been different from their other children, more focused on image and status than on genuine connection. He said that both he and Sofia had been concerned about Isabella's frequent changes in relationship status, her tendency to be drawn to wealthy partners, but that they had hoped marrying me would help her settle down and find genuine happiness. I forgave them because they weren't responsible for their adult daughter's choices. We agreed to stay in touch, and over time, Miguel and Sofia became something like surrogate parents to me, filling some of the void left by my own parents' passing. It was one of the unexpected positive outcomes from a terrible situation. 6 months after everything happened, I sold the Greenwich mansion. The house held too many painful memories, and I realized I had never actually wanted to live there. It had been my father's home, not mine. I bought a smaller property in Vermont, a restored farmhouse on 40 acres of land where I could have privacy and peace. I restructured the technology company with new partners who were thoroughly vetted and whose backgrounds were carefully investigated. I also made a decision about how to use the experience productively. Working with Sarah Mitchell's investigation firm, I helped establish a consulting service that teaches people how to identify and protect themselves from financial manipulation in personal relationships. The service provides education about prenuptial agreements, estate planning protection, and warning signs of gold digger behavior. It's not about making people paranoid or preventing genuine relationships. It's about giving people tools to protect themselves while still remaining open to authentic connection. The question people ask me most often is whether I regret not pressing criminal charges, whether I wish I had sent Isabella, Thomas, and Castellano to prison. The answer is no. Would it have been justified? Absolutely. Would it have been satisfying in some ways? Probably. But it also would have consumed years of my life in legal proceedings, kept me connected to people I needed to move on from, and turned me into someone focused on punishment rather than healing. What they lost was significant. Isabella lost her chance at a wealthy marriage and financial security. Last I heard, she was working a regular job in New Jersey. Her reputation damaged enough that targeting wealthy men was no longer a viable strategy. Thomas lost his career in technology and had to start over in a completely different field at 43 years old. Castellano was disbarred and now works in compliance for a financial services company, a dramatic step down from running his own law practice. Those consequences happened naturally as a result of their choices and the agreements they signed. I didn't have to pursue them vindictively. I didn't have to spend emotional energy on revenge. Instead, I was able to focus on rebuilding my life, on learning from the experience, and on becoming more discerning about who I allow into my inner circle. A year and a half after everything happened, I met someone new. Her name is Catherine, She's a veterinarian who owns a practice in Vermont, and she has no idea who the Whitmore family is or what I'm worth. We met when I brought a stray dog I found on my property to her clinic. The dog, which I eventually named Cooper, had been abandoned and was in poor condition, malnourished and frightened. Catherine spent 3 hours that first evening caring for Cooper, never once asking about payment, simply focused on helping an animal that needed her expertise. I stayed at the clinic while she worked, and we talked about everything except money and inheritance. She told me about growing up on a dairy farm in upstate Vermont, about how she had known since she was 8 years old that she wanted to be a veterinarian, about the challenges of running a small practice in a rural area where many clients struggled to afford care. She talked about her philosophy of veterinary medicine, which was that animals deserved the same quality of care regardless of their owners' financial situations, and how she often provided services at reduced cost or even for free when she knew families were struggling. What struck me most about Catherine was her complete lack of interest in my background. She didn't ask what I did for work, didn't question how I could afford the emergency veterinary care for a stray dog, didn't probe about where I lived or what brought me to Vermont. She was simply present in the conversation, focused on the immediate situation, and genuinely engaged with me as a person rather than as a potential opportunity. We dated for 8 months before I told her about my inheritance. 8 months of dinners at local restaurants, hikes through the Vermont mountains, quiet evenings at her small house in town, and weekends at my farmhouse where she never once asked why I owned 43 acres when I lived alone. During those 8 months, I fell in love with her kindness, her competence, her dry sense of humor, and her absolute groundedness in reality. She was someone who measured success by the number of animals she saved and the quality of care she provided, not by the size of her bank account or the value of her assets. When I finally told her about the inheritance, we were sitting on my back porch, watching the sunset after a long day of helping her spay and neuter community cats as part of her clinic's outreach program. I had been trying to find the right moment for weeks, and I realized there would never be a perfect moment, so I simply started talking. "I need to tell you something about myself that I should have told you earlier," I said. "I come from a wealthy family. My father left me a substantial inheritance when he passed away 2 years ago. I own a technology company, real estate properties, and investment portfolios. I'm not someone who needs to work, though I choose to stay involved with my father's business because it matters to me." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she asked a question that told me everything I needed to know about her character. "Does it make you happy?" she said. "Or does it feel like a burden?" I was stunned by the question because no one had ever asked me that before. Everyone assumed that inheriting $48 million must make you happy, that wealth automatically translated to joy. But Catherine had immediately understood that inheritance can be complicated, that money can carry emotional weight, that what looks like privilege from the outside can feel like responsibility or even obligation from the inside. "It's complicated," I told her honestly. "Having financial security is a privilege I don't take for granted. But inheriting this much at 28 years old before I had really established my own identity, separate from my family's wealth, has been challenging. It's made relationships complicated because I never know if people are interested in me or in what I have. It's made business decisions complicated because I'm managing my father's legacy rather than building something entirely my own. And it's made me the target of people who saw me as an opportunity rather than as a person." Then I told her about Isabella. I told her the whole story about the cameras, the conspiracy, the betrayal, the confrontation, and the choice I had made to pursue consequences rather than prosecution. Catherine listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just taking in the story. When I finished, she was quiet again for several minutes. Then she said something that made me certain I wanted to spend my life with her. "That must have been incredibly painful," she said. "Not just the betrayal itself, but discovering that your entire relationship had been constructed. I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm glad you told me because it helps me understand why you've been so cautious about letting me close. But I want you to know that the person I fell in love with is the man who spent 3 hours with a stray dog, who helps me with community spay days, who reads veterinary journals with me and asks thoughtful questions, who remembers the names of all my clients' animals. That person has nothing to do with your bank account. We've been together for 2 years now, and while I'm more cautious than I was with Isabella, I've also learned that the answer to betrayal isn't to stop trusting entirely. The answer is to trust more wisely, to pay attention to patterns over time, and to value consistency over grand gestures. Catherine has never asked me for money, has never suggested ways I should spend my inheritance, has never expressed interest in changing her own modest lifestyle, despite knowing I could afford to change it for her. She still drives the same 12-year-old truck she was driving when we met, still lives in her small house in town during the week, and still works 60-hour weeks at her clinic, because that's what her commitment to her patients requires. What Catherine did accept after much discussion and some negotiation was my offer to fund an expansion of her clinic that would allow her to hire 2 additional veterinarians and serve more low-income clients. The expansion wasn't framed as a gift, but as an investment in work I believed in, and Catherine insisted on structuring it legally so that she maintained full control of the clinic's operations, and I was simply a financial backer with no say in medical decisions. That arrangement worked for both of us, allowing me to use my inherited wealth in a way that aligned with my values, while respecting Catherine's independence and professional autonomy. The broader lesson I've learned from this experience is about the relationship between wealth, character, and justice. Inheriting substantial money at a young age gave me options that most people don't have, including the option to pursue justice in a way that prioritized my own healing over public vindication. I could afford to let Isabella walk away without pressing charges because I didn't need to recover any money from her. I didn't need a judge to validate that what she did was wrong, and I didn't need the satisfaction of seeing her punished to feel that justice had been served. But that same wealth that gave me options also made me vulnerable in ways that people without wealth don't experience. I became a target specifically because of my inheritance. My relationship with Isabella was fundamentally shaped by her knowledge of my financial situation, even when I wasn't aware of it. And my business partnership with Thomas was corrupted by the same wealth I had inherited. Wealth created opportunities but also created risks that required careful navigation. The question of whether I made the right choice in not pressing criminal charges is one I've thought about extensively. There are compelling arguments on both sides. The argument for prosecution is that Isabella, Victoria, Thomas, and Castellano committed serious crimes that merit punishment, that allowing them to avoid prison might enable them to victimize others, and that the legal system exists precisely to handle cases like this. The argument against prosecution is that the legal process would have consumed years of my life, kept me emotionally connected to people I needed to move on from, and wouldn't have added significantly to the consequences they were already facing through the civil agreements I enforced. What tips the balance for me is understanding that justice and punishment are not synonymous. Justice means ensuring that wrongdoing has appropriate consequences, and that those consequences address the harm caused. Isabella lost her marriage and her chance at wealth, which addressed the harm she tried to cause. Thomas lost his career and his business partnership, which addressed his breach of professional trust. Castellano lost his law license, which addressed his abuse of his professional position. These consequences were proportional. They were directly related to what each person did wrong, and they happened without requiring me to become consumed by the process of punishment. Moreover, the information Sarah's investigation uncovered, particularly about Victoria's company and the broader network of people targeting wealthy inheritance recipients, was turned over to federal investigators and led to a much larger case that addressed the systemic problems these individual prosecutions wouldn't have solved. Victoria's cooperation with that investigation in exchange for avoiding charges herself ultimately led to more justice than prosecuting her alone would have achieved. There's also something to be said for the power of grace, not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies the wrongdoing is excused, but grace in the sense of acknowledging someone's wrongdoing while choosing not to exercise the full extent of your power to punish them. Isabella, Thomas, and Castellano know that I had the power to send them to prison and chose not to. That choice carries its own weight, creates its own kind of accountability, and perhaps opens more possibility for genuine transformation than punishment would have. I don't know what happened to Isabella after our divorce was finalized. The last I heard, she was working in New Jersey and keeping a low profile. Victoria went through the federal investigation and ended up with a suspended sentence and significant community service requirements after her cooperation led to the conviction of several other people involved in the wealth targeting network. Thomas moved to Oregon and started over in a completely different field, working in environmental consulting, far from the technology industry where his reputation was destroyed. Castellano took a job in compliance and risk management, using his legal knowledge in a way that doesn't require him to have a law license. Whether any of them have genuinely changed, whether they've learned from what happened and become better people, I have no way of knowing. That's not my responsibility to determine or to monitor. My responsibility was to protect myself, to hold them accountable, and then to move forward with my own life. I've done that, and I'm at peace with the choices I made. The consulting service I helped establish with Sarah Mitchell's firm has worked with over 200 clients in the 2 years since we started it. The service provides education about protecting yourself from financial manipulation in relationships, covering everything from prenuptial agreements to estate planning strategies to warning signs of gold digger behavior. What we've learned is that the most effective protection isn't suspicion or walls, it's wisdom and discernment. We teach people to pay attention to patterns over time, rather than to grand gestures in the moment. We teach them to value consistency over intensity, to notice how someone treats people who can't benefit them, to observe whether someone's actions align with their words. We teach them the difference between appropriate caution and paranoid suspicion, between protecting yourself and closing yourself off from genuine connection. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work has been helping people who have already been victimized. People like the real estate developer Marcus Chen, who I mentioned earlier. People who are trying to figure out how to move forward after discovering that someone they loved was actually manipulating them. We provide resources, support, and community for people processing this specific kind of betrayal, which has its own unique challenges separate from other forms of relationship breakdown. The educational programs we've developed are now used by estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, and wealth management firms to help their clients navigate the relationship challenges that often accompany significant inheritance or sudden wealth. We've found that proactive education is far more effective than reactive crisis management, that teaching people what to look for before they're in a vulnerable situation helps them avoid manipulation rather than having to recover from it. Looking back now, 2 years after everything happened, I can see how the experience has shaped me in ways both painful and positive. I'm more cautious about relationships, yes, but I'm also more intentional. I think more carefully about who I allow into my inner circle, but I also appreciate more deeply the people who earn that trust. I understand vulnerability better, both my own and others, and I have more compassion for people who make mistakes because they're desperate or confused or misguided. The relationship with Miguel and Sophia, Isabella's parents, has evolved into something genuinely meaningful. We have dinner together once a month, alternating between their home in New Jersey and my farmhouse in Vermont. They bring Catherine's favorite desserts. We talk about their other children who are apparently doing well and who were as shocked as their parents by Isabella's behavior, and we've developed a connection that has nothing to do with Isabella and everything to do with shared values and mutual respect. Miguel told me once that having a relationship with me helps them hold on to the hope that Isabella might still change, that if I could forgive them for their daughter's actions and remain in their lives, perhaps there's hope for Isabella to eventually become the person they raised her to be, rather than the person she became in pursuit of wealth. I can't give them certainty about Isabella's future, but I can give them my presence and my friendship, which they've told me means more than I might realize. The Greenwich Mansion's new owners invited me to visit 6 months after they moved in. They had restored several features that had fallen into disrepair, updated the gardens, and filled the house with the life and energy of their family. Seeing the house transformed from a place of painful memories into a home full of joy helped me complete the process of letting go. The house isn't mine anymore, and that's exactly how it should be. My father's technology company is thriving with new leadership and a restructured ownership arrangement that includes employee stock options and profit sharing. Moving away from Thomas's involvement was initially disruptive, but it also created an opportunity to build a more collaborative and ethically grounded business culture. The company now has explicit policies about conflicts of interest, financial transparency, and ethical decision-making that were either absent or too vague before. Thomas's betrayal led to positive changes that have made the company stronger. The investment portfolios my father left me are being managed by a new firm with more oversight and clearer ethical guidelines. Part of the restructuring involves dedicating 20% of the annual returns to charitable causes, particularly focused on education and literacy programs, the same causes that Isabella had pretended to care about. That choice feels like reclaiming something she tried to corrupt, using my father's wealth for genuine good, rather than allowing the association with manipulation to taint how I think about philanthropy. If this story reminded you that protecting yourself doesn't require destroying others, Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring that bell. I'd love to hear in the comments, how do you balance being open to trust while also being smart about protecting yourself? Have you ever had to make a choice between punishment and peace? Thank you for watching. And remember, justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like choosing your own peace over someone else's punishment, choosing wisdom over bitterness, and choosing to remain open to genuine connection despite the risk of betrayal. The dangerous path that leads to wisdom is always better than the safe path that leads to isolation. See you in the next one.